Tonight, we begin with a moment that Washington feared, intelligence agencies anticipated, and the White House quietly prepared for, but hoped would not arrive this soon. It didn't come through weeks of back-channel diplomacy or leaked negotiations. It came in a single, carefully staged televised address from the Kremlin. One speech that instantly shattered long-held assumptions about this war. One speech that forced U.S. officials to acknowledge classified assessments they never planned to reveal. And one speech that may, carefully speaking, signal the opening chapter of the end of the deadliest conflict Europe has seen since World War II. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line American officials expected would hold for at least another year. This was not a hint, not a trial balloon, not a vague reference to peace. Putin publicly laid out a timeline, what he called a 2026 framework, to bring the war to a close. And the moment those words aired, the Pentagon reacted fast. Not with applause, not with relief, but with urgency, skepticism, and a counter timeline that stunned analysts on both sides of the Atlantic. For months, something had been building beneath the surface, not through official statements or diplomatic cables, but through subtle signals. Moscow had been aggressive, yes, but predictable. Western intelligence had learned Russia's rhythm: missile strikes on set days, troop rotations on a steady cycle, propaganda surges tied to symbolic dates. That rhythm suddenly stopped, and when Moscow goes quiet, alarm bells ring in Washington. Encrypted military traffic dropped off. Supply movements from Belarus and occupied territories slowed. Strategic bomber activity at Engels Air Base shifted. Kremlin advisor communications spiked and then went dark. Analysts recognized the pattern immediately. Silence like this doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means something big is coming. For 3 straight days, the National Security Council held emergency meetings. Satellite imagery was reviewed frame by frame. State Department officials made urgent calls to Berlin, Paris, and London, all asking the same question: what is Moscow preparing? No one had a clear answer until this morning. Early today, Russian state television abruptly cut into regular programming for what it labeled a special presidential address. These broadcasts have become familiar over the last 3 years. Long speeches about Russian endurance, Western decline, and inevitable victory. But this time was different. Putin sat at his now famous long table, looked directly into the camera, and announced what he called a strategic recalibration, a plan to bring major combat operations to an end under a defined framework. This kind of announcement is never accidental. When Putin speaks like this, he's signaling something very specific, whether it's an attempt to negotiate from perceived strength, fracture Western unity, or acknowledge that the current course cannot continue. Analysts couldn't immediately agree which one applied. Some believe it was all 3 at once. But one thing was clear: Putin had changed his public posture. And when the leader of a nuclear-armed nation does that without private warning, every intelligence agency in the Western world pays attention. Within hours, the Pentagon scheduled an emergency press briefing. What was revealed there has already reshaped expectations about how and when this war could end. The response from U.S. defense officials was anything but routine. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't measured. It was urgent. Senior officials described Putin's declaration as calculated, strategic, and, most unsettling of all, possibly genuine. And that's what makes it dangerous, because this wasn't just rhetoric. Putin's 2026 framework included concrete elements, including proposals for a demilitarized zone along current front lines and a commitment to halt offensive operations. That proposal came with strings attached, most notably a demand for sanctions relief tied directly to a ceasefire timeline. And that detail matters, because this was not just a gesture toward peace. It was the most detailed public framework Russia has offered since the war began. A framework designed to look reasonable on the surface while locking in leverage underneath. But strategy only works if the other side hesitates. Ukraine didn't. Within hours of Putin's address, President Volodymyr Zelensky convened an emergency war cabinet, not routine coordination calls, not status updates. These were high-level sessions Ukraine reserves for moments when major decisions are about to be made. And by nightfall, those decisions became public. Ukrainian military officials confirmed that Zelensky authorized an immediate acceleration of offensive operations across 3 critical sectors. First, the Zaporizhzhia front, where Ukrainian forces have been steadily probing Russian defenses. Second, the Kherson region, where cross-river operations have intensified. And most significant of all, deep strike operations targeting Russian logistics networks inside occupied Crimea. Ukraine moved fast, and deliberately. Before Moscow could control the narrative, Ukrainian forces struck ammunition depots near Jankoy. They hit command facilities outside Sevastopol. They disrupted key rail junctions believed to be staging points for future Russian offensives. This wasn't random. This was targeted pressure. The message was clear. Ukraine was dismantling the very infrastructure that would have allowed Putin's 2026 framework to be negotiated from a position of strength. This is what triggered urgency inside the Pentagon. Putin's announcement wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. Left unanswered, it could have tested Western unity. Ukraine understood that risk and responded with force, not recklessness. They avoided civilian targets. They avoided strikes inside Russian territory proper. Every hit focused on military infrastructure and command networks. The signal was unmistakable. Peace will be negotiated, not dictated. And here's where the story deepens. U.S. intelligence officials now believe Putin's move was designed as a stress test of the Western alliance, a way to see whether NATO would fracture under the weight of a public peace offer, whether war-weary European populations would pressure leaders into accepting terms favoring Moscow, whether the United States, heading into another election cycle, would hesitate. Instead, the opposite happened. The Pentagon didn't flinch. It responded with a counter-assessment so detailed, so methodical, that even the Kremlin took notice. Defense analysts, speaking anonymously, described Putin's proposal as a desperation maneuver, an attempt to appear reasonable while maintaining maximalist demands. And Washington's response showed this scenario had been anticipated for months. This wasn't reaction. This was preparation. As the day unfolded, the scale of the Western response became clearer. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin confirmed accelerated delivery of advanced air defense systems to Ukraine. The State Department announced an additional $23.3 billion security assistance package, one of the largest single commitments since the war began. NATO officials, meeting in emergency session in Brussels, reportedly agreed on security guarantees designed to hold even in the event of a ceasefire. This wasn't symbolism. This was coalition coordination at the highest level. Strategic communication meant to send a single message. Western resolve has not weakened. And that resolve is the one thing Moscow has failed to break since February 2022. Every major Russian push has been met with a coordinated response that raises the cost. Every propaganda campaign has been countered with transparency. And every attempt to pressure the alliance has produced the opposite effect. To understand why this moment matters so much, we have to step back and remember how this war was supposed to go, at least in Moscow's calculations. Vladimir Putin believed Ukraine would collapse in days. Kyiv would fall in a weekend. President Zelensky would flee. NATO would fracture under economic pressure. Europe, dependent on Russian energy, would cave. None of that happened. Tonight, the reality is the exact opposite. Ukraine isn't just surviving, it's launching coordinated offensive operations. NATO didn't fracture, it expanded, welcoming both Finland and Sweden. Europe didn't capitulate, it diversified its energy supplies and held firm on sanctions. And now, for the first time since the invasion began, it is Russia, not Ukraine, floating peace timelines. It is Russia looking for an exit ramp. It is Russia calculating whether the cost of continuing this war is becoming unsustainable. And that's what makes this moment so volatile. Putin's 2026 declaration didn't come from a position of confidence. It came at a time of mounting domestic pressure. Russian military bloggers are demanding faster results on the battlefield. Oligarchs want sanctions lifted and frozen assets unlocked. Mothers want their sons home from a war they were told would be quick. Hardline nationalists want total victory with no compromises. Putin is trying to balance all of this while managing an economy that is showing clear signs of strain. Defense spending now consumes more than 40% of Russia's federal budget. Inflation is climbing faster than official figures suggest. Labor shortages are forcing factories to offer record wages just to keep production lines moving. When leaders facing this kind of pressure make sudden strategic moves, they aren't acting from strength. They're acting from vulnerability. Washington understands that. The Pentagon's assessment, now shared with congressional leaders from both parties, was crafted to send a very specific signal. The United States will not accept a premature peace that rewards aggression. Defense officials stated plainly that Putin's framework violates the principles of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. In diplomatic language, that's a firm rejection. The concern in Washington isn't peace itself. The concern is a false peace, a pause dressed up as resolution, a ceasefire that allows Russia to rearm, regroup, and return stronger later. Intelligence officials have a name for this kind of maneuver, and they are determined not to let it happen. Then came Kiev's response. President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation in a calm but defiant speech. He reminded Ukrainians and the world that proposals and frameworks have come before. What has never come is Russian withdrawal. A timeline without troops leaving Ukrainian land, he said, is not peace. It's occupation with a deadline. Zelensky also made something else clear. Ukraine's partners understand this. And tonight they proved it. This wasn't rhetoric. This was a wartime leader speaking to allies whose political cycles, public opinion, and fatigue all create moments of vulnerability. Zelensky knows those risks, and the response from Washington may be the clearest signal yet that Ukraine will not be pressured into accepting a bad deal. Here's what makes this moment even more dangerous and far more complex. Putin's 2026 declaration did not happen in isolation. Almost immediately after the televised address, Russia began moving on multiple fronts. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov announced a rapid diplomatic tour to Beijing, New Delhi, and Brasilia, capitals that have maintained working relationships with Moscow. At the same time, Russian state media launched a coordinated messaging blitz portraying Russia as the side seeking peace, while branding the West as reckless warmongers. And beneath the surface, Russian cyber activity targeting European infrastructure surged. Quiet reminders that Moscow's leverage extends well beyond the battlefield. All of this unfolded within a 48-hour window. When Putin moves this many pieces at once, it's never accidental. This wasn't just a peace offer. It was a pressure campaign, a coordinated test to see whether the coalition would hold when presented with an apparent off-ramp. Analysts are now weighing several possibilities. One is that Putin is genuinely preparing for negotiations, having concluded that outright military victory is no longer achievable. Another is that he's attempting to fracture NATO unity by appearing reasonable while demanding terms no sovereign nation could accept. And the third, perhaps the most concerning, is that Putin is trying to lock in territorial gains before shifting political dynamics in the West change the strategic landscape. But today, Ukraine and the Pentagon shut that door. They didn't hedge. They didn't equivocate. They didn't signal openness to negotiations on Moscow's terms. Instead, they responded with clarity, unity, and a counter-narrative that rejected the premise of Putin's proposal entirely. What we're witnessing now is a test of resolve. Putin is probing for signs of Western fatigue. President Zelensky is making it clear that Ukraine will not accept peace at any price. The Pentagon is focused on preventing a premature settlement that rewards aggression. And European allies are determined to avoid a frozen conflict that leaves Russian forces permanently positioned near NATO borders. For now, those objectives remain aligned, but alignment requires constant reinforcement, and tonight's response was exactly that. According to intelligence officials, Russian forces have not drawn down along the front lines. Logistics networks remain active. Supply movements continue. That suggests preparations for sustained operations, not de-escalation. Analysts believe the 2026 framework is part of a broader influence campaign designed to shape public opinion ahead of key elections in both Europe and the United States. Ukraine, meanwhile, is not slowing down. Its response, swift, coordinated, and disciplined, sent a clear message to Moscow. Timelines mean nothing without action. And it sent an equally important message to the West, that Ukraine remains a committed, capable partner worth supporting. As the coming weeks unfold, more details will emerge about what Putin truly hoped to achieve with this declaration. But what's already clear is that the Pentagon's response was decisive. It reassured allies that U.S. commitment has not wavered. It signaled to Moscow that rhetorical maneuvers will not fracture the coalition, and it gave Ukraine the political space to continue operations without being pressured into a premature deal. What happens next depends entirely on Putin's next move. If he escalates, this moment may be remembered as a turning point toward prolonged conflict. If he genuinely seeks negotiation, the West has already shown it is willing to engage, but only on terms that respect Ukrainian sovereignty. And tonight, something unusual is happening in Moscow. The Kremlin is quiet. Too quiet. And when Putin goes quiet, it usually means he's recalculating, choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin was reminded of something he has encountered before, but may never have fully accepted. Ukraine will not break. The West will not abandon its allies. And timelines imposed by aggressors are not peace. They are ultimatums. This story is far from over. But one thing is now unmistakably clear. This war will not end on Putin's terms. It will not end on Putin's timeline. And if it ends in 2026, it will be because Ukraine and its partners decided the terms were acceptable, not because Moscow declared it so. And we'll be here watching every move as the next phase unfolds.